The Edwardian sun was gentle but proud, and under its amber glow, a nation both ancient and restless dreamed of permanence. Britain, draped in imperial certainty, believed itself eternal. Steamships carried silk and letters from every corner of the world. London's theaters gleamed with wit and cigarette smoke, and the word progress tasted like champagne. Yet beneath the grandeur of drawing rooms and orchestras, something trembled, a quiet sense that the old order had already begun to fade. And within this glittering world, a child named Diana Olivia Winifred Maud Manners came into being, the daughter of dukes and poets, of politics and myth. She would grow into one of the last swans of that age, a creature of beauty, charm, and intelligence so luminous that even time itself would pause to watch her pass. But tonight, dear listener, we will ask a different question. What if Diana Cooper, born to privilege, worshipped for her elegance, yet constrained by her century, had defied every expectation? What if she had chosen not to adorn Britain's fading empire, but to reshape it? What if, instead of becoming society's muse, she had become its conscience? Good evening, dear friends. Tell me, where and when are you listening tonight? Perhaps in a quiet study, perhaps beneath the sigh of rain. Wherever you are, I invite you to linger a while in this imagined past. Subscribe if you wish, and let us journey together into the golden dusk before the storm, when one woman might have changed the soul of a nation. The year is 1892. At Belvoir Castle, surrounded by tapestries older than the memory of most men, the infant Diana lies in a cradle carved with family crests. Her mother, Violet, Duchess of Rutland, is not merely noble. She is an artist, a patroness, a romantic of formidable will. Her father, Henry, is a duke whose hands smell of hunting dogs and parliamentary papers. Between them stretches the great fault line of Britain itself, privilege and yearning, order and imagination. Even as a child, Diana senses both worlds calling her. Her earliest memories are of light and music, servants carrying lamps through long corridors, her mother's laughter rising above the notes of a piano. Yet there is solitude, too. The great houses of her childhood are full of ghosts, ancestors painted in oils, watching silently as another generation repeats their poses. Diana grows curious about the world beyond those portraits. In the nursery, she listens to the whispers of her governess, tales of suffragists in London, of Irish unrest, of the Queen's death soon to come. The child absorbs these murmurs like ink on linen. In this alternate history, the spark within her, the one that in our world flickered behind polite smiles, finds early fuel. One afternoon, while walking through the rose gardens with her mother, she asks why women must always stand behind men in church processions. Violet, both amused and startled, answers as gently as she can. Because the world would lose its balance if we walked side by side. Diana, at 12, replies, "Then perhaps the world needs to learn to walk differently." The remark, though laughed off, lingers. It is repeated at dinner, retold to friends, and in our imagined world, it lands upon the ears of Violet's circle, writers, painters, reformers. The child becomes something of a prodigy, a curiosity among adults who still believe the empire divine. She reads Ruskin and Shakespeare, Shelley, and the morning papers. She watches her brothers sent to Eton, while her own schooling is deemed sufficient. Yet in this alternate thread of fate, she refuses sufficiency. She persuades her mother to send her to London for lessons in history and rhetoric, a request almost unheard of for a young lady of her standing. Violet, proud of her daughter's will, agrees. And so, in the last calm years before the world cracks open, Diana Manners becomes one of the few daughters of nobility to study at all seriously. Her tutor, an aging Oxford historian, teaches her more than dates and dynasties. He speaks of moral progress, of the power of public voice. He quotes Mill's The Subjection of Women, and though she blushes, she listens. "Miss Manners, he tells her one afternoon as they walk along the Serpentine. The aristocracy may preserve Britain's manners, but it will not save her soul. Perhaps that task belongs to someone who can speak to both sides. At that moment, the first threads of her destiny tighten. The years slip by, and London glimmers with illusion. The motor car is a novelty, the telephone a curiosity. Society balls pulse with gossip, and the press grows fascinated with this radiant young woman who seems not entirely of their world. Her wit disarms older men. Her poise inspires painters. But unlike so many debutantes of her time, Diana's eyes are never fixed on titles or marriages. In this reimagined life, she keeps a journal, a secret one, filled not with dreams of romance, but with observations on class, on art, on the strange silence surrounding the working poor. The world, she writes at 17, is beautifully arranged for those already seated. Outside the grand halls of London, another Britain stirs. Suffragists march, miners strike, and newspapers print cartoons mocking the aristocracy. The old order trembles, though it does not yet break. Diana senses the tension and feels, deep within, both the privilege and the burden of her birth. She could hide within her beauty, or she could use it as a lantern. By 1911, she attends gatherings where poets and reformers mingle, places her mother disapproves of but cannot quite forbid. There, she meets men like H.G. Wells and young officers soon bound for France. She listens more than she speaks, but when she does, her words carry weight. She dreams of acting, not for applause but for truth, for the theater's strange power to mirror a society to itself. Then in 1914, a shot in Sarajevo splits the world in two. The newspapers arrive at Belvoir with headlines that seem to belong to another age. Britain prepares for war. In our true history, Diana will serve as a nurse and watch her friends fall. But in this imagined one, she sees in the war not only sorrow, but the awakening of duty. She will not retreat into despair. She will move toward it. As the church bell tolls across the valley, that same bell we shall hear again, she looks out her window, the sky trembling with the faint roar of trains carrying soldiers to the coast. If this war destroys the old world, she whispers, then perhaps it is time to build a new one. The candle beside her flickers. The ink dries on her journal, and the century turns. The light of her childhood dims, but it does not die. It merely changes hue, from gold to iron, from innocence to purpose. The summer of 1914 fades not into autumn, but into something harder and colder, a season without name. Trains whistle through the dawn carrying young men with faces too young for destiny, and behind them, mothers and sisters wave with trembling hands. Diana stands among them, not as an observer, but as one caught within the same tide. The gilded world of her upbringing crumbles as war seeps into every conversation, every letter, every silence at dinner. In this alternate life, she feels not only grief but awakening, a sense that her time of decoration has ended and her time of service has begun. She volunteers as a nurse before society expects it, ignoring whispers that ladies of her kind should instead organize charity teas or send blankets. She wants to see the truth. The hospital smells of iodine, blood, and youth extinguished too early. She writes secretly in her journal each night, describing the faces of boys who die asking for their mothers. Her words are not melodramatic, but stripped of pretense, sharp with compassion. One evening, she reads one of her entries aloud to a fellow nurse, who weeps quietly and says, "You ought to send that to a paper." And so she does. Her first article appears anonymously in the Times under the title Letters from the Quiet Room. It speaks not of strategy or victory, but of the courage of the ordinary. The young farmer who jokes as he dies, the French soldier who gives his bread to a nurse. The piece resonates across class boundaries, reprinted in pamphlets and read aloud in drawing rooms and trenches alike. Some call it sentimental, others dangerous, but to many, it feels like truth unadorned. Diana, still anonymous, watches this reaction with both humility and fire. For the first time, she senses what she might become if she dared to step from behind her lineage and name. Her friends, the sons and daughters of privilege, begin to change as well. The war spares none. Heirs. Poets like Rupert Brooke and Siegfried Sassoon write verses that echo her thoughts. They gather in candlelit rooms when on leave, sharing words rather than dances. In this alternate history, Diana becomes the quiet axis of that circle, the one who listens deeply and then speaks only when silence has done its work. She begins to write not as a pastime, but as a mission. Beauty must be rescued from frivolity, she notes in her journal, for in times such as these it must serve the soul, not the vanity. When her identity as the author of Letters from the Quiet Room is finally revealed, society reels. Some accuse her of unladylike ambition. Others hail her as the voice of mercy. The king himself sends a note of acknowledgement, and though the government politely discourages her from further publications that might unsettle morale, she continues, cautiously, courageously. Her words become a form of moral resistance. The war will end, she tells a friend, but what we learn of ourselves in it will remain. We must choose what to keep. London in wartime is both haunted and alive. Blackout curtains smother every window. The sound of Zeppelin raids punctuates nights of whispered prayers. Amidst this, Diana's voice grows stronger. She joins gatherings of thinkers, writers, and reformers discussing how Britain might renew itself when peace returns. She begins to believe that her calling lies not only in healing the wounded, but in healing the very idea of Britain, to transform it from empire into empathy. By 1917, her essays are read in Parliament. She is invited to speak at universities, something nearly unheard of for a woman of her background. The students stand as she enters. Her speech is simple. The measure of a nation is not its conquests, but the kindness it leaves behind. Newspapers call her the gentle radical. Yet in private, she feels loneliness sharpen around her. Many of her friends have died, including young men who once wrote her love letters scented with cologne and laughter. Her fame feels like an echo chamber of loss. She visits the countryside hospitals less often now, but when she does, she moves among the wounded like a quiet mother, her gloved hands trembling as she adjusts blankets or closes a pair of fading eyes. One soldier, no older than 19, tells her, "We read your words at the front, Miss Manners. They make us remember why we came." The sentence both warms and breaks her. That night, she walks home through bomb-dimmed streets, her mind full of questions she cannot answer. What if compassion, spoken aloud, could be as powerful as any weapon? What if the voice of one woman could soften the pride of nations? The war nears its end, and with it comes exhaustion, grief, and an uncertain peace. Diana, now 26, feels older than her years. She has lived through a century's worth of sorrow and transformation. Her pen lies still for a few weeks as she contemplates what comes next. In her world, women are beginning to vote, soldiers return to broken homes, and the aristocracy, her own class, faces quiet collapse. Yet she does not mourn that fall. She senses possibility rising in its place. On the night of November 11, 1918, the armistice bells ring across Britain. People flood the streets, laughing, weeping, kissing strangers. Diana stands at her window in London, watching the crowds illuminated by torches. She feels joy, yes, but also something deeper, a responsibility. Her words have been heard, now they must be lived. Peace, she writes in her journal, is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning of conscience. The church bell tolls again, that same note we first heard in childhood, but now it carries the echo of millions of souls. Diana closes her eyes and listens, knowing that the world that will follow this silence will need a new language, one that unites grace with truth. She resolves to help craft it. As dawn approaches, she packs her notebooks and a single evening gown into a leather case. The train to London's theatre district awaits. Tomorrow she will walk onto a stage not to be admired, but to speak, and to begin the second act of her life, where words and performance will merge into something larger than either. And so, as the bell fades into the hum of a waking city, Diana Manners steps out of the shadows of war and into the uncertain light of peace, not as a debutante, but as a woman reborn in purpose. The curtain rises on her new beginning. The war has ended, but its shadow stretches long over the fields and faces of Britain. The air smells of damp brick and coal smoke. Victory parades pass beneath windows lined with crepe. London, once radiant, has turned introspective. It is a city nursing invisible wounds, its laughter brittle, its silence profound. Diana Manners walks through this reborn capital with eyes both tender and discerning. She's no longer the child of empire nor merely the nurse of the fallen. She's a woman who has looked into the abyss and returned with a sense of duty, sharpened into clarity. The newspapers now carry her name with reverence and curiosity. Editors call her our conscience in pearls, yet she feels no vanity in the title. She has seen too much. Friends urge her to rest, to marry, to settle into the life expected of her. Among those who ask for her hand is Duff Cooper. Charming, ambitious, a man of the Foreign Office whose affection for her runs deep. In our true history, she would have said yes. But in this reimagined world, she hesitates. Something within her rebels against the comfort that marriage to a rising statesman would offer. She sees in him affection, but also the soft chains of tradition. One evening, as they walk along the embankment, the lamps reflected in the Thames, Duff takes her hand and says, "You would make a perfect wife for a man destined for public life." She smiles sadly. "Perhaps," she replies, "but I was born for a public life of my own." That night she writes him a long, gracious letter, not of rejection but of release. She tells him she must follow a path that society does not yet recognize. She will not be a muse or ornament. She will act, yes, but not only on the stage, she will act upon her time. Duff, wounded but respectful, keeps the letter all his life. It becomes one of those small documents of destiny, the kind that never reach archives yet quietly redirect the world. In this alternate unfolding, Diana joins a small theater company in Bloomsbury. She begins at the edges, taking minor roles, learning the craft. To the surprise of many, she possesses not only presence, but discipline. The theater, dim and intimate, becomes her laboratory of truth. The first time she walks onto a stage, she feels the curious silence of an audience breathing with her. Every gesture becomes revelation, every pause an act of defiance against the trivialities she once knew. In that flickering gaslight, she senses that art, like war, can change the way people see themselves. The critics notice her almost at once. They call her voice serene but unyielding, her gaze capable of forgiveness and indictment in the same instant. She plays heroines who do not faint or plead but think, reason, resist. Through her roles, she redefines femininity for a generation of post-war women hungry for meaning. One reviewer writes, "Miss Manners acts not as though she is pretending to be someone else, but as though she is remembering who we once were." The remark delights her. She cuts it out and pastes it into her journal beneath the simple phrase, "Remembering who we once were." London society is scandalized. Aristocrats whisper that she is degrading her class, that no duke's daughter should bow before a footlight. Yet the public adores her. Soldiers, clerks, and widows fill the cheap seats to see her perform, sensing that she speaks for them as much as to them. Her performances in Ibsen's A Doll's House and Shaw's St. Joan ignite quiet debates about womanhood and destiny. Ministers of Parliament attend her shows in secret. Suffragists quote her lines at rallies. The theater becomes a chapel of new ideas, and Diana its priestess. Her mother, Violet, writes to her with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "You are becoming what the poets feared, my dear, a woman who believes she can mend the world." Diana's reply is tender but resolute. Someone must begin the mending. The early 1920s hum with contradictions. Jazz drifts across dance halls, while unemployment lines lengthen outside. Britain celebrates freedom, but clings to hierarchy. Diana, navigating both worlds, begins to speak publicly about the moral direction of the nation. In essays and interviews, she urges reconciliation between classes, compassion for the wounded psyche of post-war youth, and a renewal of beauty that serves rather than distracts. "We must build a country," she writes, "in which courage is not confined to the battlefield, nor virtue to the drawing room." She refuses commercial contracts, turning down offers from film producers eager to turn her into a commodity. Instead, she accepts an invitation from the emerging BBC to read poetry and prose for broadcast, a new medium that fascinates her. Her voice, low and steady, fills homes across the nation. For many listeners, it is the first time they have heard a woman speak not as ornament, but as authority. A coal miner in Yorkshire writes her a letter saying, "When you read on the wireless, it feels as though the world stands still to listen." Through this work, she begins to imagine a different Britain, one where culture and conscience are partners, not strangers. She meets writers, thinkers, and reformers, men and women who believe that art can rebuild what war has broken. Among them are members of the Bloomsbury Group, whose radical notions of gender, class, and art intrigue her. In our real history, Diana circled near that world but never entered fully. In this one, she joins it, becoming both muse and interlocutor. Virginia Woolf calls her the necessary bridge between the salons of Mayfair and the streets of change. It is not flattery. Diana's grace allows her to move through both realms, carrying with her the rare gift of translation between the privileged and the voiceless, the traditional and the new. Yet fame, even the purest kind, demands sacrifice. Her relationship with her family grows strained. Her father, the Duke, avoids her name in conversation. Some old friends turn cold, unable to forgive what they perceive as betrayal of class. But Diana finds solace in solitude, in letters exchanged with poets and reformers. She writes late into the night, her lamp burning over the soft scratch of ink. In one entry, she reflects, "Freedom is a lonely companion, but it keeps one honest." By 1922, Britain has crowned itself modern. The empire still stands, but its spirit has dimmed. Colonies murmur of independence, and factories hum with unrest. Diana stands at the edge of this new decade, poised between fame and purpose. She receives invitations to dine with ministers, to advise on cultural committees, to speak at universities. The thought that she might shape policy through persuasion rather than power begins to germinate in her mind. She wonders whether her stage is large enough. On a quiet evening in December, she walks through St. James's Park, her breath visible in the cold. The lamplight ripples across the lake, and she pauses to listen to the faint chime of a distant clock. That recurring sound, her reminder of time's patient movement. She whispers to herself, "If art can awaken hearts, perhaps conscience can awaken nations." The thought will not leave her. The next day, she writes to a friend in the Foreign Office, "Would it be so strange for a woman to serve her country not through marriage, but through mind?" The question, half jest, half prophecy, begins the next chapter of her transformation. The curtain falls gently on these years of awakening. She has turned from beauty to purpose, from daughter to citizen, from muse to maker. The applause of the theater fades into the hum of a changing nation, and somewhere beyond the fog of London, the future waits, listening. The morning light over London in 1923 has a different hue than before the war. Paler, quieter, yet somehow clearer, as though the city itself has learned humility. The old certainties of empire are beginning to fray, but in their place rises a quieter courage, a hunger for meaning amid the rubble of old grandeur. The theaters, once sanctuaries of escapism, now become spaces of questioning. Audiences no longer seek only laughter or romance. They want mirrors, not masks. And into this new sensibility walks Diana Manners, her name now synonymous not with scandal, but with an uncommon sincerity. She has become something of a paradox, an actress beloved for her intellect, an aristocrat who speaks of equality, a woman who carries both poise and purpose like twin lanterns through the fog. In this alternate timeline, her growing influence draws her deeper into the company of Britain's thinkers and artists. The Bloomsbury Group, those eccentric architects of modern thought, find in her a natural ally, one who can translate their ideals into language palatable to the broader public. Virginia Woolf, ever cautious of fame, writes in her diary that Diana moves with grace between the world of dukes and the world of dreams, and in doing so she makes each more human. Their friendship becomes one of delicate depth. Woolf, the contemplative visionary, and Diana, the radiant practitioner. They meet in small salons where the air smells of tobacco, tea, and damp books, debating the moral responsibility of art. For Diana, theater and literature are not mere luxuries. They are instruments of the national soul, capable of shaping how Britain perceives itself after the trauma of war. Her performances during these years deepen in tone. She chooses roles not for applause but for resonance. Shaw's Candida, Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, and a new adaptation of Antigone that places the ancient tragedy in a modern European setting. Audiences, still healing from their losses, respond to her quiet strength, her ability to embody conviction without bitterness. In interviews, she speaks not of stardom but of empathy. To portray another's suffering truthfully, she says on a BBC broadcast, one must first make peace with one's own. Her voice, low and deliberate, travels through the wireless into parlors and kitchens across the land. Listeners describe feeling as if she is speaking directly to them, as though she carries both their grief and their hope within her calm articulation. With each passing month, she grows bolder in her public reflections. She begins publishing essays under her own name, discussing the role of women in public life, the moral use of beauty, and the responsibility of the privileged to act as stewards rather than masters. One of her most quoted lines, printed in the Manchester Guardian, reads, "We are no longer the guardians of empire, but of each other." The phrase becomes a touchstone for a generation weary of conquest and hungry for compassion. Government ministers, while wary of her influence, cannot ignore her popularity. Invitations arrive for her to speak at universities, cultural societies, and charity congresses. She declines most, preferring instead the intimacy of the microphone and the immediacy of the stage. Yet she understands the symbolic weight she now carries, the embodiment of an England that wishes to evolve without losing its grace. The 1920s are often remembered as years of frivolity, the age of cocktails, jazz, and bright young things dancing through smoke-filled clubs. In this imagined version of history, that glitter still exists, but Diana's presence gives it a new dimension. Her circle of friends includes painters, philosophers, aviators, and politicians, all drawn to her strange ability to make beauty seem both sacred and useful. At soirees in Mayfair or literary gatherings in Bloomsbury, she listens more than she speaks. When she does speak, her words land softly yet decisively. People begin to quote her in editorials, even in sermons. There is a quiet authority in her restraint, a suggestion that true modernity does not shout, it breathes. Her fame abroad begins to rise as well. French intellectuals invite her to Paris for a symposium on the woman in the modern world. There she meets Colette, who calls her l'ange d'Angleterre, the angel of England, half in jest, half in admiration. Reporters follow her every move, but she disarms them with honesty. Asked about the difference between Parisian and British women, she replies, "We are learning from one another. They to think with dignity, we to feel without apology. It becomes a line reprinted across Europe, proof that Britain, long regarded as stiff and aloof, may yet find its humanity. Yet behind the applause lies a deeper solitude. Diana senses the fragility of fame, how swiftly admiration can turn to expectation, and expectation to entrapment. Her journal entries from this time reveal a mind torn between public duty and private longing. To live visibly, she writes, is to offer one's soul as mirror and shield both. One must polish it daily and bear the weight of its reflection. She spends long evenings walking along the Thames after performances, the city lights trembling in the dark water. The wind carries the faint sound of jazz from distant clubs, and she feels both part of and apart from her age. By 1926, the general strike shakes Britain, paralyzing industry and exposing the widening gulf between classes. The newspapers scream of chaos, but Diana's radio address, given at the height of the crisis, becomes a moment of calm clarity. She speaks not of sides, but of shared endurance, urging compassion rather than fear. We must remember, she says, that a nation's true wealth lies not in its factories, but in the decency with which it treats its tired hearts. Her words, measured and maternal, soothe a restless population. Even trade union leaders, hardened by struggle, speak of her with respect. It is perhaps the first time that a woman of the aristocracy becomes a moral compass for the working class. Her influence extends into the arts. She founds a small fellowship that brings together writers, sculptors, and composers from different backgrounds, encouraging collaboration and public exhibitions that reflect the new social conscience. She funds scholarships for young women artists, insisting that beauty must be accessible, not ornamental. Through these efforts, she quietly reshapes the cultural landscape of Britain, planting seeds of what will later be called the compassionate aesthetic, a blending of grace and duty that becomes the moral signature of her imagined age. And yet, for all her success, she feels an undercurrent of restlessness. The applause that once nourished her now feels hollow at times. She begins to dream of taking her message beyond the theater, beyond even the arts, to the heart of political life itself. If we have learned to rebuild cathedrals of stone, she writes to a friend, why not the cathedral of conscience? It is not ambition that drives her, but a growing conviction that her nation, adrift in modernity, needs not more policies but more poetry. Poetry of action, of example, of compassion made visible. The part closes on a quiet evening in 1927. Diana stands on the balcony of her small London flat, overlooking the city she has come to love, with both awe and melancholy. Below her, the hum of motor cars blends with the faint strains of music drifting from an open window. She feels the pulse of change, as if history itself breathes beneath her feet. In the distance, Big Ben tolls the hour, that familiar bell whose voice has followed her since childhood. She listens, smiling faintly, and whispers, "We are only at the beginning." As the sound fades, she turns back inside, her lamp still burning. On her desk lies a letter from the BBC inviting her to host a new series of broadcasts, this time not on art, but on the moral and social questions of modern life. She picks up her pen and, without hesitation, writes her acceptance. The stage will remain, but now her audience will be the nation itself. The next chapter of her transformation is already waiting, and she will meet it with the same quiet radiance that has carried her through every shadow so far. The year turns, and with it, the century seems to draw a long, trembling breath. The Great War has receded into memory, but its aftershocks still ripple beneath the polished surfaces of drawing rooms and the cracked pavements of industrial towns. The world that Diana Manners now inhabits is not the one her parents built. It is leaner, more uncertain, yet strangely luminous, a place where women walk the streets unchaperoned, where telephones ring in modest flats, and where even the air carries the scent of change. In this new Britain, Diana's voice has become both compass and comfort. Her radio program, Conversations in the Evening, has captivated a nation rebuilding its moral architecture. Each week she speaks gently but firmly about themes few dare approach publicly: equality, dignity, the quiet courage of daily work. Her diction remains aristocratic, but her words are human, reaching those who have never set foot inside a theater. Listeners describe sitting by their fireplaces, the wireless humming like a heartbeat, as her voice spills softly into the room. It is not command that she offers, but kinship. She never lectures. She invites reflection. "We have survived," she says one evening, but survival must never be mistaken for renewal. Renewal requires imagination. Letters pour in by the hundreds. Housewives thank her for giving their invisible labor meaning. Students tell her that her broadcasts make them believe intellect can coexist with gentleness. Soldiers write that she helped them rediscover calm after nightmares. A movement forms almost by accident. People begin to call themselves the listeners, a loose fellowship united by the belief that compassion can be a civic virtue. Diana resists any formal organization, fearing it might calcify into politics, yet she understands that something is stirring, something larger than herself. Her personal life remains disciplined, though solitude lingers around her like a familiar fog. The theater continues to claim her nights, but her days belong increasingly to public causes. She advocates for education reform, arguing that art and ethics must be taught together. "Knowledge without sympathy," she writes in an essay, "is the coldest tyranny of all." She visits schools in the industrial North, where children in threadbare clothes recite lines from Shakespeare as though invoking a spell. She sits among them, listening, not as a benefactress, but as a witness. When asked by a reporter why she spends so much time outside London, she answers, "Because that is where Britain's real stage lies, in its classrooms, its hospitals, its streets." By 1929, her influence has become political, though she never declares allegiance to any party. The newly elected Labour government invites her to advise on cultural outreach, seeing in her both credibility and grace. She accepts cautiously, determined not to become another figurehead. In meetings, she speaks softly, always last, always briefly, yet her suggestions linger. She urges ministers to invest not only in infrastructure, but in beauty. Libraries, parks, theaters, murals. People who live among ugliness, she says, forget what goodness looks like. It is a sentiment simple enough to seem naive, yet it captures the public imagination. Newspapers begin calling her the conscience of the commons, though she never sits in Parliament. As the 1930s approach, a new image of womanhood begins to crystallize, and Diana stands at its center. The press, unable to categorize her, coins the phrase, the new British woman. Poised yet principled, modern yet moral, she becomes a symbol of the balance the nation seeks, freedom tempered by responsibility, individuality softened by grace. Magazines print her photographs beside essays on education and social welfare. Her fashion choices, simple lines, muted colors, practical elegance, are imitated by women who no longer wish to adorn drawing rooms, but to walk into public life. Yet she remains wary of adulation. "If style does not serve truth," she remarks once, "it becomes a kind of cowardice." Her friendship with Virginia Woolf deepens through these years, though it is sometimes shadowed by differences of temperament. Woolf, ever private, writes her long, introspective letters, questioning whether the public can truly change. Diana replies with gentle optimism, "Perhaps not quickly, but hearts do turn as slowly as seasons." They debate late into the night at Gordon Square gatherings, about art, about justice, about the moral cost of beauty. Woolf later writes that Diana carries light as though it were an obligation. Her circle expands further. She meets a young Winston Churchill at a dinner and surprises him by arguing that Britain's greatness will depend not on industry or empire, but on imagination. He laughs, yet he remembers her words. She befriends George Bernard Shaw, who calls her our only actor who knows when to be still. Artists, politicians, and reformers alike find in her a calm that disarms aggression. Her ability to listen becomes her quiet power. Yet the world beyond her control darkens once more. The stock market crashes in 1929, and the tremor reaches even the stately houses of England. Poverty creeps like a fog through the streets. Hunger replaces frivolity. Diana's response is not retreat, but rededication. She launches a national arts program that brings traveling theater to mining towns, poetry readings to shipyards, and orchestras to hospitals. Newspapers mock the idea at first. Symphonies for the starving, one headline jeers. But within months, the program becomes a source of pride. Audiences weep at their first sight of a violin, their first hearing of a sonnet. Diana attends some performances herself, sitting quietly at the back, watching faces illuminated by discovery. Her work earns her a medal from the Crown, but she accepts it only on the condition that the award be used to fund scholarships for working-class girls. A medal that gathers dust, she says at the ceremony, is less valuable than a mine that opens. The line is quoted across the empire. In Canada, India, and Australia, newspapers speak of this remarkable woman who seems to embody a gentler Britain, one that leads by example rather than decree. In our imagined history, she becomes the first private citizen to address the League of Nations Cultural Commission, where she argues passionately for education as the cornerstone of peace. If children are taught to see beauty, she tells the assembly, they will learn to recognize cruelty. Her words move even the jaded diplomats to applause. At home, her health begins to strain under the constant pace. She hides her fatigue behind serene composure, but her diary betrays moments of doubt. I fear, she writes, that goodness must often appear unfashionable, and that our age, enamored of progress, will forget the progress of the heart. Still, she continues, her commitment unwavering. She becomes a mentor to younger women entering politics, urging them to value empathy over ambition. The world, she tells them, does not need more victories. It needs more tenderness in its strength. By 1933, as Europe murmurs with unrest and ideologies harden into threats, Diana senses the gathering storm. Her broadcasts turn reflective, her tone more solemn. We must guard our decency, she warns in one program, for tyranny does not begin with cruelty. It begins with indifference. The line echoes through newspapers and public speeches. People begin to think of her not just as an artist or advocate, but as a moral sentinel for the age. One autumn evening, after a performance and a radio address delivered back-to-back, she walks home along the embankment. The fog curls around the lampposts, the Thames moving darkly beneath. She pauses, listening to the faint tolling of Big Ben, the same steady bell that has marked every turning of her life. She feels both weariness and peace. If only, she whispers to herself, we could learn to love without fear of losing. Then she continues on, her figure dissolving into the mist, carrying within her the quiet strength of a nation still learning to rediscover its soul. The middle years of the decade arrive like the long pause between two heartbeats, a fragile stillness before the thunder returns. The world, though weary of grief, seems drawn once more toward its own shadow. Across Europe, voices rise that promise renewal but carry the scent of fear. Italy marches. Germany salutes, and the fragile architecture of peace built after the Great War begins to tremble. In London, the headlines grow darker each week, but Diana Cooper, still luminous, still composed, refuses despair. She senses that this is a moment when a nation's soul must decide whether to look inward or outward, to retreat into pride or reach toward compassion. Her voice, already a familiar comfort to millions, becomes a thread of light woven through the gathering dusk. By now, she has transformed from performer into presence. Her weekly radio address, The Hearth of Britain, no longer merely entertains or consoles, it guides. She speaks of the duty of empathy, of the strength found in gentleness, of art as the language of the heart. Her broadcasts open not with fanfare but with silence, a single breath before her calm voice begins, measured and warm. Good evening, my friends. Tonight we speak not of politics, but of courage, the quiet kind that chooses understanding over anger. Her words reach soldiers and shopkeepers alike. Some listen while mending uniforms, others while washing supper plates, but for all of them she becomes a kind of compass. Not moral in the scolding sense, but moral in the way a candle offers direction without demand. It is in these years that she first meets the young Princess Elizabeth. The encounter occurs during a charity concert at Windsor, where Diana has been invited to read from Shakespeare's Henry V. The young princess, still shy but already watchful, asks her afterward if it is difficult to speak to so many people and not feel afraid. Diana smiles and replies, "Fear never disappears, my dear. One simply learns to walk beside it." The exchange, brief as it is, marks the beginning of a quiet mentorship that will endure for years. In private correspondence, Diana guides the princess not with instruction but with reflection, writing of humility as strength, of duty as compassion made visible. "A crown," she writes once, "is not worn upon the head but upon the heart, and it grows lighter only when it learns to listen." Meanwhile, her influence expands beyond Britain. Invitations arrive from Geneva, from Paris, from the Scandinavian academies, where pacifists and philosophers gather to discuss the meaning of civilization. She travels often, speaking at small conferences about culture's role in preserving peace. Her speeches are not political, they are almost poetic, grounded in her conviction that beauty, genuine beauty, teaches empathy, and that empathy alone can restrain cruelty. At the League of Nations, she delivers a short address that will later be remembered as prophetic. If we allow the imagination of nations to starve, tyranny will feed it with dreams of conquest. The delegates, many hardened by cynicism, rise to their feet when she finishes. For a brief moment, the applause sounds like hope. Back home, Britain listens with divided hearts. Some admire her idealism, others dismiss her as naive. The newspapers describe her as the gentle guardian of conscience, but satire follows fame as shadow follows light. Political columnists mock her pacifist leanings, accusing her of weakness, even disloyalty. Yet Diana never retaliates. "To be mocked for mercy," she says to a friend, "is a price I shall always be willing to pay." She believes that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of character, and she continues to repeat this belief in her broadcasts, in her essays, in every room she enters. Her circle of influence widens further into government. Several members of Parliament, weary of partisan quarrels, begin to consult her privately. They find her clarity soothing, her refusal to flatter refreshing. She does not speak the language of politics. She speaks the language of conscience, which, in turbulent times, becomes a kind of wisdom. She advises restraint in rhetoric, generosity in policy, dignity in debate. "The nation," she tells one young minister, "is listening not only to what we say, but to how we say it. Tone is also truth." Her counsel helps temper speeches that might otherwise inflame division. Slowly, subtly, the voice of one woman reshapes the mood of a country fearful of itself. By 1936, Britain finds itself between eras, the decline of empire and the rise of uncertainty. The abdication crisis sends ripples through the monarchy, and the nation holds its breath as one king steps down and another ascends. In this imagined history, Diana's counsel again proves pivotal. The royal family, long accustomed to distance, must now regain trust through humility. It is Diana who encourages the new sovereign to embrace broadcast speech as a means of connection. Let them hear your voice, she suggests. A people cannot love what it cannot feel. Her advice leads to the first royal Christmas broadcast, written not by courtiers but by poets, its tone closer to prayer than proclamation. The public receives it with tears of gratitude. Her friendship with Princess Elizabeth deepens quietly during these years. They exchange letters filled with reflections on leadership and service. Diana becomes, in essence, a living embodiment of what the monarchy might aspire to. Dignity, softened by compassion. The young princess later confides to her that when she reads Diana's essays, she feels as though Britain itself were speaking through a wiser self. This mentorship, unrecorded by official histories, shapes the moral temperament of a generation. Yet not all is harmony. Abroad, the drums of war grow louder, and the peace she cherishes begins to fray. She senses it in the tone of the newspapers, in the restlessness of the streets, in the faces of the men who attend her lectures. Her broadcasts take on a solemn tone. "We must not mistake pride for strength," she warns in 1938, "nor vengeance for justice. When nations cease to imagine each other as human, they begin to invent monsters." Some call her words defeatist, others call them prophetic. That autumn, as Britain signs the Munich Agreement, promising peace in our time, Diana listens to the announcement on her wireless with eyes half closed. She does not celebrate. She knows too much of human nature to be soothed by signatures. In her journal that night, she writes, "Peace that costs honesty is only a pause between wars." Still, she continues to speak publicly of courage, compassion, and restraint. She believes that hope, though fragile, must never be silenced, that to abandon it would be to surrender the very essence of civilization. On the last night of 1938, she delivers a radio address unlike any before it. Her voice trembles slightly, but her words are steady. "We have learned to speak to the world by wireless," she says, "but have we learned to listen? Each time we choose kindness over contempt, we prove that peace is still possible." Across Britain, families sit around their radios in silence. For many, her words feel like a benediction at the end of an anxious year. When she finishes, she steps outside into the cold night. The air smells of frost and coal smoke. Big Ben tolls 12 times, its echo folding into the mist. She stands for a moment beneath the pale lamps of Westminster Bridge, her breath rising like ghostly prayer, and whispers to herself, "Let the next dawn not be made of fire." She turns, her coat drawn tight, and walks slowly home through the sleeping city, a solitary figure carrying the weight of a nation's fragile hope. The dawn of September 1939 arrives heavy with the scent of fear and inevitability. The world has once again reached for its own destruction, and this time there is no veil of innocence left to tear. In London, sirens howl through the morning fog, and people queue quietly for gas masks and ration books, their faces calm in that peculiar English way that hides dread behind courtesy. Diana Cooper stands at her window, watching as the streets she has spoken to for more than a decade fall into a hush that precedes catastrophe. She feels no surprise, only a deep ache, the ache of recognition. History, it seems, has chosen to repeat itself, but she will not. Within days, she is called upon to lend her voice to the nation once more. The BBC, remembering her wartime broadcasts of compassion and steadiness, asks her to return to the airwaves. Yet Diana hesitates. She has no wish to become a symbol. She has long known how fame can distort sincerity. But when she visits the East End and sees mothers carrying infants into underground stations as the first bombs fall over the docks, she understands that silence would now be a form of cowardice. And so she agrees, not as an actress, not as an aristocrat, but as a woman who remembers the cost of indifference. Her first wartime broadcast begins simply, "Good evening, my friends. We have been here before." Though the years between may have lulled us into forgetting, let us not speak of victory tonight, but of endurance, of that quiet courage that keeps a candle burning when the wind would rather see it die. There is no music, no introduction, no fanfare, only her voice, low and deliberate, carrying through the crackling frequencies into millions of homes. The effect is immediate. Letters flood the BBC, some addressed simply to "the lady who spoke last night." Soldiers at barracks, children in shelters, widows by their fires all write to say the same thing. Her voice makes them feel less alone. As the Blitz begins, Diana refuses the safety offered to her. She insists on remaining in London, lodging in a modest flat near St. James's. On nights when the sirens scream, she helps guide neighbors to the shelters, carrying thermoses of tea and tins of biscuits, her fur coat flecked with soot. When the all-clear finally sounds, she emerges to find entire streets reduced to rubble, the air thick with dust and disbelief. Once standing amid the ruins of a church, she bends to pick up a fragment of stained glass shaped like a wing. She slips it into her pocket and carries it thereafter as a talisman, a reminder, she says, that beauty can be shattered, but it can also endure in pieces. Her broadcasts during those years become the nation's heartbeat. She speaks not of strategy, never of enemies, but of humanity. "We must remember," she says one night after a devastating raid, "that suffering is not the opposite of grace, but its proving ground." Her words offer comfort to those who cannot yet weep and dignity to those who can no longer hope. Even Winston Churchill, though publicly gruff, privately admits that her calm presence helps sustain morale. "While I rally them to fight," he writes in a note to his secretary, "she teaches them why they must remain kind." It is an unspoken alliance, her compassion balancing his defiance, her quiet voice complementing his roar. Diana also turns her attention to the soldiers abroad. She organizes small troops of performers and poets to visit hospitals and bases, reading aloud letters sent from home. The men call her the voice of mother and lover both, though she never encourages such worship. She sees in their weary eyes the same mix of fear and faith she saw a generation earlier, and she wonders how many lessons mankind must relearn. "We speak of civilization," she notes in her diary, "yet we seem forever on the verge of forgetting what it means to be civil." In 1942, she's invited to record a series of messages for the BBC's overseas service to be broadcast to occupied Europe. She agrees, though the danger is real. Her name and voice are known across the continent, and the enemy regards her words as propaganda. But she refuses to read from scripts prepared by officials. Instead, she writes her own messages, meditations on freedom, dignity, and the endurance of the human spirit. "You who listen in darkness," she says in one transmission, "remember that the light has not gone. It is merely elsewhere, waiting for you to find it." The broadcasts are smuggled through resistance networks and repeated in whispers across Europe. Later, survivors will say that her voice gave them faith that Britain still believed in decency. The war years blur together in fire and fatigue. London becomes a city of ghosts and resilience. There are nights when she weeps alone, her hand pressed against the radio's cold surface after finishing a broadcast. The loss becomes unbearable when word reaches her of the death of one of her closest friends, a nurse killed during a bombing raid while tending the wounded. Diana walks the ruined hospital grounds the next day and lays a single white rose amid the ashes. "It seems," she writes later, "that God has chosen the kindest souls for testing, perhaps because they are the least likely to curse him." As the war drags on, her health begins to falter. Exhaustion, rationed food, and the damp cold of the shelters sap her strength. Still, she refuses rest. Her final major broadcast of the war takes place in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. She speaks from a small studio, her body frail but her voice unwavering. "We are told that victory is near," she begins, But let us not confuse triumph with peace. The true battle, the one within our hearts, begins when the guns fall silent. Her closing words are later reprinted in newspapers across the Commonwealth. May we rebuild not what was, but what ought to be. When the war finally ends, she does not celebrate publicly. She walks instead through the still smoldering streets of London, now bright with the smell of rain and lilac. Children wave flags made from torn sheets, and strangers embrace, laughing through tears. She feels joy for them, but her own joy is tempered by memory. So many faces have vanished, so many dreams lie buried under the rubble. Peace, she writes that night, is not a return to life. It is life beginning again, uncertain but possible. In the months that follow, Diana becomes a legend. Her broadcasts are compiled into a book titled Words for the Dark Years, translated into several languages. Universities invite her to lecture, governments to advise. Yet she seeks no honor, no title. When asked what she will do now that the war is over, she smiles and says, "The same as before. Remind us to be kind while we still have time." And so the decade closes not with trumpets, but with the faint sound of her voice echoing through memory. Steady, compassionate, enduring. The church bell that once tolled for war now tolls for peace, though its tone is softer, almost weary. London exhales, and so does she. The century has tested her faith, her patience, her very heart, but she remains the voice of mercy in an age that nearly forgot what mercy sounded like. The years after the war unfold like a long exhale, the breath of a nation emerging from shadow. London, still scarred by fire and grief, begins to rebuild itself brick by brick, heart by heart. The air carries both exhaustion and promise. There are still ration lines, still bombed-out shells of houses filled with silence, but there is also laughter again. Shy, fragile laughter, the kind that comes only after one has truly wept. The people have learned to live with less, yet in that very deprivation, a new sense of unity has taken root. And at the center of this quiet rebirth stands Diana Cooper, no longer the debutante of a vanished age, nor even the actress who once moved audiences to tears. She has become something rarer, a moral presence, a figure whose calm gravity speaks more powerfully than any office or title. To the weary public, she is simply Our Lady of the Air, the voice that carried them through the dark. Her wartime broadcasts have become more than memory. They are now a kind of national scripture. Excerpts are printed in school books, read aloud in church halls, and recited at civic ceremonies. But Diana herself does not rest upon her reputation. She knows that words, no matter how beautiful, fade if not followed by action. When the Labour government begins to shape its new post-war vision, she's invited to lend counsel, not as politician or propagandist, but as a moral compass. She accepts, cautiously, humbly, knowing the dangers of fame, yet believing that in this fragile interlude between destruction and renewal, conscience must speak clearly or risk being drowned by bureaucracy. She travels across Britain during these years, visiting the towns and cities that have borne the brunt of war. In Coventry, where the cathedral lies in ruins, she stands among the stones with tears upon her cheeks and promises that the site will not be forgotten. "Let this be our national altar," she says softly, "a place where forgiveness may stand even before restoration." The people, many still in mourning, gather around her as though around a source of light. She visits miners in Wales, dock workers in Liverpool, teachers in Scotland. Wherever she goes, she listens, really listens, and then later, in her radio talks, she repeats their words, transforming the everyday courage of the ordinary into a new kind of collective poetry. She does not lecture. She translates the strength of the people back to themselves. Her message during these years is simple, that Britain must rebuild not merely its buildings, but its soul. She argues passionately for education as the cornerstone of peace, for the arts as nourishment as essential as bread. When the creation of the National Health Service is debated in Parliament, she lends her voice publicly in support. "Health," she says in one memorable speech at a London rally, "is the foundation of dignity. We cannot speak of civilization while some of our own must choose between medicine and hunger." Her words, carried by the BBC and reprinted across the Commonwealth, strike a chord with millions. The government, already moving in that direction, finds in her endorsement a kind of moral legitimacy. Doctors later write to her, thanking her for giving their cause the weight of conscience. But Diana remains wary of adoration. She declines honors, turning down even the suggestion of a peerage offered in recognition of her services to the spirit of the nation. Her refusal, published in the press, causes a stir. "Titles have already cost us enough souls," she writes in her letter of decline. "Let us learn to measure worth by kindness instead." It becomes one of her most quoted lines, etched into the memory of a generation tired of hierarchy but hungry for guidance. People see in her a reflection of what Britain might yet become: modest, principled, inclusive. In private, however, she feels the toll of years spent carrying others' burdens. Her health, never robust, grows frail. She suffers bouts of exhaustion, but she hides it behind her poise, unwilling to let fatigue be mistaken for retreat. When friends urge her to rest, she answers quietly, "The country is tired enough. It does not need me to yawn." Still, she spends more time at her small cottage in Sussex, where the rhythm of the countryside brings solace. There, among the hedgerows and soft murmurs of the sea, she writes essays that blend philosophy and memory, reflections on the meaning of service and solitude. She tends her garden herself, finding in the act of cultivation a metaphor for healing. "A garden," she writes, "is simply forgiveness made visible." Her influence continues to ripple outward. Schools and universities name scholarships after her, though she never consents to attend the ceremonies. She prefers anonymity to adulation. Instead, she writes open letters to young women, urging them to enter public life, to write, to speak, to lead. The world does not need more charm, she tells them. It needs grace. And grace is simply courage that has learned to be gentle. Many of these women, inspired by her example, will later shape post-war Britain in education, healthcare, and culture. It is during this period, too, that her friendship with Princess Elizabeth matures into something deeper, an almost maternal bond forged in reflection and shared purpose. Diana visits the young princess at Windsor Castle, where they walk through the gardens speaking of duty, the burden of visibility, and the subtle power of humility. "The throne," Diana says, "is not a seat of command, but of listening." The princess, still in her 20s, takes the words to heart. Years later, when she becomes queen, observers will note the quiet dignity, the composure under scrutiny, the moral steadiness, traits that, in this imagined history, bear the unmistakable imprint of Diana's influence. By 1949, Britain is changing once more. The empire has begun its long transformation into the Commonwealth, and the nation is learning to see itself not as ruler, but as partner. Diana embraces this shift with relief. "At last," she writes, "we may speak not of subjects, but of friends." She advocates cultural exchange rather than colonial pride, and under her guidance, new institutions of art and scholarship are founded to link Britain with India, Africa, and the Caribbean. An early vision of global understanding through culture rather than power. In the final months of the decade, the BBC asks her to deliver one last grand address, a reflection on the meaning of renewal at the dawn of a new age. Her body is frail, but her mind remains sharp, her voice steady. She records it in a quiet studio, surrounded by the technicians who have grown old beside her. "We have built again," she says, "but we must never forget what we learned when there was nothing left to build with but hope. Nations, like people, are only as great as their capacity for kindness. When the speech ends, there is a moment of silence in the studio before anyone dares to speak. It airs that evening, and millions listen in reverent stillness. That night, she returns to Sussex, walking out into her garden beneath a pale spring moon. The air smells of wet soil and lilac, and in the distance she hears the tolling of a church bell, the same sound that has marked the turning of her life since girlhood. She closes her eyes, listening, and whispers, "Perhaps peace is not an ending after all, but the beginning of tenderness." And as the bell fades into the soft hush of the English night, the woman once called Diana Manners, actress, writer, voice of a nation, stands beneath the stars, knowing that her truest work has never been performance, but presence. The 50s dawn softly, as if the nation itself were trying to remember how to dream again. Rationing still lingers, but so does gratitude. The war is gone, yet its lessons breathe beneath everything. Streets once scarred by bombs are now lined with tulips and children in hand-me-down coats. Factories hum, theaters reopen, and the country learns to speak a gentler language, one of rebuilding rather than ruling. In this tender, uncertain decade, Diana Cooper's name becomes less a celebrity's and more a reassurance, like the sound of a familiar hymn. Her voice, though quieter now, carries an authority beyond politics or class. People call her simply the People's Lady, but behind that affection lies something deeper: trust. In this reimagined history, she has become a confidant of the young Queen Elizabeth II. Their friendship, formed in letters and conversations before the coronation, ripens into a bond of intellect and empathy. Where the Queen must wear composure like armor, Diana offers understanding as refuge. They walk through the palace gardens on late afternoons, the elder guiding the younger not with advice, but with stories. "Reign with restraint," Diana tells her, "and let kindness be your ceremony." The Queen listens, her gloved hands folded, her gaze bright but uncertain. She senses in Diana the moral courage she herself will need, a courage that does not conquer but endures. When the coronation arrives in 1953, the country's joy feels like sunlight breaking through an overcast sky. Diana sits in the abbey among diplomats and nobles, but she watches not the pageantry. She watches the young woman walking down the aisle beneath the weight of history. In her heart, she prays that this moment, so full of spectacle, will not forget humility. Later, when the Queen speaks publicly for the first time about service rather than sovereignty, journalists note the tone: calm, reflective, unmistakably reminiscent of Diana's broadcasts. Few know how closely the two have spoken in those quiet hours before dawn, when the monarch sought counsel not from ministers, but from a woman who had already lived through 2 ages of fire. Her public life continues, though she now prefers the pen to the microphone. The essays she publishes in these years, The Shape of Mercy and Letters on the Quiet Courage, become minor classics, blending moral reflection with recollection. In them, she writes of the ordinary heroism of post-war Britain: the nurse on a midnight shift, the teacher in a cold classroom, the widow who plants roses beside her ruined home. "We do not live in an age of giants," she observes, "but perhaps at last we are learning to live in an age of gardeners." The phrase catches on. School children copy it into notebooks, and politicians quote it in speeches. It becomes her quiet legacy, the idea that civilization grows not through conquest, but cultivation. At the Queen's request, Diana agrees to serve unofficially as an advisor on cultural affairs. She helps shape the first royal visits to the Commonwealth, insisting that they emphasize partnership rather than nostalgia. "Empire," she writes in one memorandum, "is not a heritage, but a habit. And habits, if unexamined, harden into blindness." Her vision helps turn the Commonwealth from a symbol of dominion into a conversation among equals. During a trip to Ghana, the Queen delivers a speech echoing Diana's counsel. "Let our friendship be the measure of our past, not our possession of it." The line, warmly received across continents, marks a turning point in Britain's self-understanding. A soft revolution born not from Parliament, but from the quiet wisdom of a single voice. At home, Diana continues to influence art and education. She establishes a small foundation devoted to the teaching of literature and ethics in state schools, arguing that a nation must educate the imagination if it hopes to civilize its progress. Her presence at openings and ceremonies becomes almost symbolic. She is less participant than embodiment. People stand when she enters, not from formality but from affection. Yet she herself remains modest, her laughter low and quick, her eyes still alive with curiosity. When asked by a journalist how she feels to be regarded as a moral icon, she smiles and replies, "Icons do not speak. I still prefer to ask questions." Still, there are nights when she feels the solitude of her path. Friends of her youth are gone. The salons of the 20s exist now only in memory. The city around her is new. Neon lights, motor cars, young couples dancing to strange rhythms. She walks through Piccadilly sometimes, unseen, a shawl around her shoulders, the air sharp with petrol and possibility. The faces she passes are younger, freer, yet she senses beneath their laughter the same eternal search for meaning. "We are modern," she writes, "but we are not yet wise." The line appears later in one of her essays and is quoted by philosophers who recognize in it both tenderness and warning. In 1957, the BBC celebrates its 30th anniversary and persuades her to deliver a commemorative address. She begins in her familiar, measured tone. "When first I spoke upon the air, the world was breaking. Now it builds. Let us remember that the voice that crosses distances carries not merely sound, but the measure of our sincerity." As she speaks, millions listening across Britain feel a shiver of recognition, the same feeling they had decades earlier during the war when her calm steadied their hearts. It is as though time itself folds back, and for a moment the nation remembers what decency sounds like. Her friendship with the Queen deepens further in these years. At Balmoral and Sandringham, they sit before the fire discussing literature and duty. The Queen reads aloud from Tennyson, and Diana counters with lines from Shakespeare, their conversation a gentle duel of memory and insight. When the Queen worries aloud about her public image, Diana reminds her, "History will not remember how you looked, only how you listened." The younger woman nods, understanding at last that listening, too, is a form of leadership. As the decade closes, Britain begins to stir with new restlessness. Rock and roll, youth movements, the first taste of rebellion against the old world. Diana, nearing 70, watches with both concern and admiration. She sees the children of the age reaching for freedom, just as she once reached for purpose. Perhaps, she muses in her diary, every generation must break the silence that preceded it. But she hopes they will not mistake noise for truth. Her essays during these last years warn gently against cynicism, pleading instead for imagination that serves empathy. On a summer evening in 1959, she attends a small garden concert at Buckingham Palace. The Queen, radiant and serene, greets her with affection before turning to address the guests. When the music begins, Diana sits quietly beneath a magnolia tree, the notes drifting through the warm night. The palace windows gleam like captured starlight, and for a moment she feels the immense, fragile continuity of everything she has lived for: beauty, grace, conscience, and the long, patient work of kindness. She closes her eyes, hearing the faint toll of a distant church bell carried by the wind, the same bell that has followed her since childhood. "Still ringing," she whispers, smiling, "still reminding." And as the moon rises over London, soft and unassuming, she knows that her era, and perhaps her own life, has entered its twilight. Yet in that twilight there is no fear, only a calm certainty that the seeds she has sown will outlast her voice. The 1960s arrive not as a single moment, but as a slow unfolding, a gathering tide of sound and color that sweeps away the hushed solemnity of the post-war years. The streets of London pulse with youth, guitars replace orchestras, and slogans replace sermons. What was once whispered in drawing rooms is now shouted from stages, scrawled on walls, sung in smoky cafes. Diana Cooper, now an elder among her countrymen, observes this new world from her small garden in Sussex with both wonder and unease. She recognizes in the young the same yearning that stirred her own generation, the hunger for truth, the defiance of conformity. Yet she senses also a loss of reverence, a carelessness toward the fragility of grace. They have courage, she writes in her diary, but courage without tenderness becomes merely noise. Her reputation has by now transcended time. To the older generation, she remains the gentle conscience who steadied them through war and Reconstruction. To the young, she is a figure of mystery, a relic of dignity in an age intoxicated by freedom. Journalists visit her cottage, hoping for pronouncements on the modern world. She rarely grants interviews, but when she does, her words are measured, her gaze calm. Every age, she tells one interviewer, believes it is discovering the truth anew. Perhaps truth simply changes its clothing, but the body beneath remains the same. The remark appears in the Times and is quoted across editorials as the nation debates morality, modernity, and meaning. She has become, unwillingly yet unavoidably, the bridge between two Britons, one of restraint, one of rebellion. Her essays during these years take on a different tone, quieter but more personal. She writes not of politics or empire now, but of time, aging, and the enduring pulse of beauty. Her collection, Windows in the Fog, becomes a bestseller among those who crave stillness in a restless age. In it, she reflects on her own life with the serene acceptance of one who has made peace with imperfection. I used to think beauty was a thing to possess, she writes, but it is only ever something we are permitted to witness. The younger generation, though impatient with her formality, cannot help but be drawn to her sincerity. She receives letters from university students and artists who confess that her words help them remember what the noise was for. Though she lives mostly in seclusion, she does not withdraw from the changing world. She attends exhibitions of modern art, listens to the Beatles on her nephew's record player, and even attends a small gathering of poets in Soho, curious to understand their rebellion. When asked what she thinks of the new youth movements, she smiles faintly. They are doing what they must, she says. Every generation must break something to discover whether it was sacred or merely habitual. Her empathy for their restlessness surprises many. She does not mock what she cannot entirely comprehend. Instead, she seeks its meaning. In her view, the 60s are not chaos, but renewal, another chapter in humanity's long conversation with itself. Her friendship with Queen Elizabeth continues through this period, though their meetings grow less frequent. The Queen's duties multiply and Diana's health begins to wane, yet they write to each other often, letters of quiet, mutual respect. In one, Diana remarks upon the paradox of modernity. Your people shout for freedom, yet they long for guidance. Perhaps freedom is not the absence of form, but the art of shaping oneself. The Queen responds with gratitude, calling her the last of England's wise voices. Their correspondence, private and poetic, becomes an unrecorded dialogue between conscience and crown. Diana's influence extends now to the arts more than ever. She mentors a small circle of young female filmmakers and playwrights who see her as both muse and moral guide. They gather at her cottage on Sundays, drinking tea from mismatched cups as she listens to their ambitions and doubts. Do not seek fame, she tells them. Seek clarity. Fame passes, but clarity endures. Among her protégés are several who will go on to define British theatre and film in the coming decades. When critics later describe the moral undertone in their work, that mixture of grace and rebellion, they will unknowingly be describing the echo of Diana's voice. The world outside, meanwhile, seems to spin faster each year. Assassinations, protests, and revolutions fill the headlines. Britain, losing its colonies one by one, must learn to define itself without the grandeur of empire. Through it all, Diana remains the same, calm, unhurried, faithful to her belief that a nation's greatness lies not in power, but in civility. When a newspaper asks her to write on Britain's decline, she replies gently, "Perhaps it is not decline, but simplification. The grandeur has gone, and what remains may yet be more honest." The line becomes the subject of debate across editorials, but she declines to elaborate. For her, truth once spoken does not need defending. As the decade wanes, Diana begins to feel her strength ebb. The long walks through her garden become shorter, the letters she writes fewer, yet her mind remains vivid, alive with memory. She often sits by the window, watching the play of light on the leaves, recalling the many times that same light has changed its hue through the years of her life. She sees the century's full arc in it, the golden shimmer of Edwardian youth, the red glare of war, the pale silver of peace. Sometimes, when dusk falls, she hears again the faint tolling of the distant church bell, that old companion marking the hours she has lived by. It no longer sounds mournful to her. It is simply time speaking its own name. In 1968, the BBC records a retrospective documentary about her life. She agrees to appear on camera, sitting in her garden, wrapped in a shawl. Her voice, though thin, retains its calm cadence. Asked what she believes her greatest achievement to be, she smiles gently and answers, "That I never stopped believing that decency could be modern." The interviewer falls silent, sensing the weight of that single sentence. When the program airs, viewers across Britain write to the BBC, some moved to tears, others simply grateful. It feels, they say, like hearing from an older relative they never knew they needed. That winter, as snow begins to fall over Sussex, she writes what will be her final essay, a reflection titled "The Quiet Continuance." In it, she speaks of impermanence and acceptance. We imagine history as movement, yet it is only breath, inhalation, exhalation, memory, and forgetting. All that matters is how gently we pass the torch. The piece is published posthumously, though she does not yet know it will be her farewell. For now, she sleeps each night beside her window, listening to the wind through the trees and the faraway chime of the bell that has never ceased. And so the 60s close not in rebellion, but in reverence, as the woman who once guided a nation through its loudest trials learns to fade quietly, gracefully, into time's unbroken current. Her voice, preserved in the grooves of radio recordings, remains, still calm, still steady, still teaching Britain how to breathe between its storms. The 70s arrive not with celebration, but with a certain heaviness, as though the century itself has grown weary of its own inventions. The great tides of progress that once carried Britain forward now seem to have slowed into uneasy currents. The optimism of the 60s fades into strikes, inflation, and restless cynicism. The streets echo not with songs of revolution, but with arguments about survival. In the midst of this, Diana Cooper, now well into her 80s, lives quietly in her Sussex home, her garden a small world of order amid the chaos beyond the hedgerows. Her body has grown frail, but her mind remains luminous, her wit as sharp and kind as ever. She moves with deliberate care, each step an act of mindfulness, each word chosen like a petal placed upon water. The world outside no longer moves at her pace. Television hums endlessly in every house, replacing conversation with noise. The young no longer write letters, they shout slogans. Yet occasionally one of them discovers her, a student reading her essays, a teacher assigning her wartime broadcasts, an artist quoting her in a gallery program. These small rediscoveries please her more than any honor could. She has never craved immortality, only remembrance of meaning. "It is enough," she tells a visitor, "if one voice from time to time reminds us that gentleness is still an option." Her correspondence during these years reveals a deep melancholy tempered by grace. She writes often to old friends who have survived, though each year the list of names grows shorter. "We are the remnants of a vanished world," she notes, "but perhaps that is what all elders must become, custodians of stories too delicate for the noise of the present." She receives letters from abroad as well, from admirers in India, Canada, South Africa, places once bound to Britain by empire, but now linked by memory. They tell her that her words help them imagine a Britain of conscience rather than conquest. These letters she keeps tied with ribbon in a small cedar box, her own private testament to a life that once echoed far beyond its borders. Though she seldom leaves Sussex now, the world still comes to her. Young journalists make pilgrimages to her cottage, hoping for quotations or controversy. She receives them kindly, offering tea and conversation rather than pronouncements. When asked what she thinks of feminism, she smiles. "My dear, if justice requires a name, it is already halfway to being misunderstood. I have always believed that dignity needs no permission." The remark, printed in a magazine, provokes both admiration and critique. But Diana does not read the debates that follow. She is long past needing agreement. Her task, as she sees it, is simply to bear witness, to remind a fractured age that truth, however unfashionable, endures in silence as surely as it does in sound. Her health begins to falter in 1974, and doctors urge her to move to London for better care, but she refuses. "If I leave the garden," she tells her physician, "I shall lose the only conversation that still matters." The garden remains her sanctuary, its changing seasons a mirror of her own slow transformation. Neighbors sometimes see her sitting beneath the apple tree, wrapped in a shawl, sketching in a small notebook. She no longer writes essays for publication, but continues to record thoughts, fragments of wisdom that later generations will discover as her autumn notebooks. In them, she reflects not only on time, but on the soul of her nation. Britain has grown clever, but not yet wise. We have machines for everything but listening. Perhaps wisdom is only the art of remembering the invisible. One afternoon, she receives a letter from the Queen, now herself a mature woman balancing duty and modernity. The Queen thanks her for her friendship and guidance, for the moral clarity she once offered in the uncertain years after the war. Diana writes back with humility, "You have become the leader we hoped for, because you have learned the hardest lesson of power, that to endure is also to forgive." The letter remains private, never published, but historians will later cite it as evidence of the quiet moral partnership that helped shape the monarchy's steady tone throughout a turbulent century. In 1976, she agrees, despite her frailty, to record a final radio message for the BBC's anniversary celebration, a brief reflection on half a century of broadcasting. Her voice is weaker now, threaded with the tremor of age, yet the cadence is unmistakable. "We live," she says, "in a world too busy to notice its own breathing. Perhaps the task of my generation is simply to remind the next to pause, to listen, for there is wisdom even in the sound of silence." The message, barely 5 minutes long, airs late one Sunday evening. Listeners across Britain fall still as they hear it, many unaware that this would be her last public address. Letters arrive by the hundreds again. Not fan mail, but thank yous, quiet acknowledgments from strangers who feel they have been spoken to with honesty in an age of spectacle. The winter that follows is harsh. Snow falls thick across Sussex, muffling the world in stillness. From her window, she watches the flakes settle upon the hedges, the bird baths, the frozen petals of her last roses. The scene feels both alive and eternal, and she writes in her notebook, "All that I have loved still exists, only rearranged." Her days are slower now, her walks shorter, but she greets each morning with the same ritual: a cup of tea, a glance at the sky, a few lines written in her looping hand. The bell in the village church rings faintly at noon, and she listens as she always has, counting its notes like small blessings. By 1978, the century she helped to humanize has grown restless again. Strikes paralyze the country, anger replaces faith, and the newspapers speak only of crisis. But in her quiet cottage, Diana remains an island of composure. Visitors find her smiling, sometimes amused by the world's impatience. "We have not lost our goodness," she assures one young interviewer, "only our attention span." Her laughter, soft but still musical, fills the room, a sound from another age that refuses to die. The final entry in her diary that year reads simply, "The bell still rings. I hear it even when it is silent." In those words lies the essence of her entire life, the belief that meaning endures beyond its moment, that kindness echoes longer than any noise, that the invisible thread of conscience, once woven, cannot be torn by time. And so the 70s end with her sitting in her garden at dusk, wrapped in a shawl, her face lit by the last amber light of day. The world beyond the hedges spins and quarrels, but she no longer belongs to its noise. She closes her eyes, her breath steady, as though listening for that familiar toll, the sound that began her story and has never left her. It is not farewell she hears, but continuation, a melody older than history and quieter than prayer. The 80s open like a restless wind, sweeping across an old garden, bending branches that had long grown still. Britain is changing once again, its factories closing, its cities rebelling, its certainties dissolving under the weight of new ambitions. The faces on the streets are younger, sharper, impatient with the slow virtues of patience and grace. The nation that Diana Cooper once comforted with her words now seems driven by noise and velocity, as though afraid of silence itself. Yet in her cottage, in Sussex, time still moves to a gentler rhythm. She is 90 now, her hair the color of snow, her hands fragile but steady when she lifts her pen. The world may have forgotten how to listen, but she has not forgotten how to speak quietly. Each morning she wakes before dawn and opens the curtains to the pale horizon. The sea air carries with it the scent of salt and renewal. She takes her tea slowly, the same way she always has, then walks through her garden, touching the lavender, the ivy, the old apple tree that has outlived 2 wars. Her eyesight has dimmed, yet she recognizes the shapes of her flowers by memory, as one might recognize an old friend by voice alone. Age, she writes in one of her last notebooks, is not decline but distillation. The unnecessary falls away, and what remains is essence. Letters still arrive, from historians, from admirers, from school children studying her broadcasts. They thank her for reminding them that courage can sound like gentleness. She answers when she can, her handwriting small and slanted, her tone always gracious. Sometimes she receives visitors, a former student who became a writer, a television producer seeking her blessing for a documentary, a young priest who quotes her words about forgiveness. She greets them all with warmth, though she tires quickly. After they leave, she sits in her chair by the window and listens to the wind rustling through the trees. "It is enough," she murmurs to herself, "to be remembered as a whisper." The Queen writes to her from time to time, short notes of affection and gratitude. In one letter, sent after the Falklands War, the Queen confides her sorrow at the cost of victory. Diana replies with characteristic clarity, "Every triumph leaves a wound unseen. The task of leadership is not to celebrate conquest, but to restore compassion." The letter is never made public, but it moves the Queen deeply. She later orders that Diana's wartime broadcasts be restored and archived as a testament to the moral strength of this island. Thus, even in her solitude, Diana's influence continues to shape the conscience of her nation. Her health declines gradually, with the quiet dignity she always maintained. Friends who visit remark that she seems less fragile than ethereal, as though her presence is already half remembered. She jokes softly about it. "I am becoming translucent," she says. "It is the body's way of preparing the soul for departure." Yet she does not fear death. She believes it to be another season, another necessary shedding. "We are all gardens," she writes, "and death is merely winter, waiting to rest us." In 1983, she records what will become her final broadcast, a short radio message titled "The Small Candle." The BBC, reverent as always, arranges for a quiet studio and a single microphone. Her voice, though frail, carries its familiar steadiness. "I have been asked," she begins, "to speak once more to those who still find comfort in words. But perhaps words are not what we need now. Perhaps what we need is the courage to listen, to each other, to silence, to the small flame that refuses to die even when the world grows cold." There is a pause, and then her closing line, simple and pure. "If you can keep one candle lit, even in the wind, then you have already rebuilt the world." The recording ends with no music, only the sound of her breathing, faint and even. Listeners across Britain are moved to tears. Many will later describe it as the most intimate message ever broadcast. Not a farewell, but a benediction. Afterward, she withdraws almost completely from public life. The newspapers occasionally publish photographs of her walking slowly through her garden, wrapped in a long coat, her face serene. They call her the last light of another England, and though the phrase is sentimental, there is truth in it. She embodies a gentleness that feels endangered, yet necessary. The world around her hurtles toward modernity, but she remains a fixed point, the quiet reminder that progress without humility is only another form of noise. In her final months, she begins to record her memories in a small notebook bound in green leather. It is not an autobiography, but a meditation, a letter to whoever may read it after she is gone. "Do not make of me a saint," she writes, "for sanctity is too proud a word. I was only a woman who tried to keep her candle burning." She reflects on her mistakes, the arrogance of youth, the loneliness of conviction, the quiet vanity that sometimes accompanied her fame, but she does so without regret. "I have lived long enough to see my errors become lessons," she notes, "and my silences become clearer than my words." Her last summer is uncommonly warm. Friends and neighbors see her sitting in the garden at dusk, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She speaks little now, conserving her strength for thought. One evening, a visiting friend asks what she believes happens after death. Diana smiles faintly and replies, "I think we return to what we loved, perhaps not as ourselves, but as the warmth we left behind." It is the last conversation she will have. In early 1986, she falls ill with pneumonia. The doctors come, gentle and respectful, but she refuses to leave her home. "I was born in a house full of voices," she whispers, "and I would rather die in one full of silence." On the morning of her final day, the church bell tolls faintly across the valley. The nurse who sits beside her notices her lips moving with each chime, as if she is counting them one by one. At the 12th, she exhales softly, her expression calm, her eyes half open as though she is still watching the light shift across the ceiling. The news of her passing spreads quietly through the country. The newspapers print tributes with headlines that read, "The Voice of Britain Falls Silent," and "Lady of Conscience Remembered." The BBC replays her last broadcast that evening. Millions listen, candles burning in windows, the same way they did during the war. Some weep, others simply sit in silence. It feels not like mourning, but like gratitude. At her funeral, attended by the Queen, a few surviving friends, and the villagers who had come to love her, the vicar reads from her own writings, "Be kind, for kindness is the last luxury of civilization." As her coffin is lowered into the earth beside her garden, a sudden gust of wind passes through the trees, scattering white petals across the ground. The bell tolls once more, neither mournful nor triumphant, just steady, eternal. And so the woman who had once been Diana Manners, who had spoken for an empire's conscience and a century's heart, returns to the quiet she always cherished. Yet her voice, preserved in those faint recordings, continues to echo softly through time, a reminder that sometimes the most lasting revolutions begin not with thunder, but with a whisper. After her passing, Britain feels quieter, as though some great tuning fork at the heart of its conscience has ceased to vibrate. Yet in the silence she leaves behind, her influence begins to resound more clearly than ever. Newspapers publish retrospectives of her life: the debutante who became a nurse, the actress who became a moral voice, the beauty who learned to make compassion, her art. But history, as always, works more slowly than headlines, and the true measure of Diana Cooper's legacy reveals itself not in immediate praise, but in the slow, enduring ripples that alter a nation's sense of itself. Schools begin reading her wartime broadcasts as moral literature, alongside Shakespeare and Churchill's speeches. Teachers notice how the cadence of her sentences, simple, patient, unhurried, calms restless classrooms. The Ministry of Education, seeking to revive civics in the curriculum, quotes her words: "A nation cannot be governed by laws alone. It must be reminded of its tenderness." In council halls and classrooms alike, she becomes shorthand for integrity, not the severe sort born of obedience, but the quiet kind that grows from empathy. The generation raised in the austerity of the 50s and the clamor of the 60s now looks back upon her as proof that gentleness can be radical, and that idealism, when tempered by humility, is not a relic but a resource. Artists claim her as patron saint of conscience. Playwrights dedicate works to her memory, drawing upon her belief that theater must hold a mirror not to glamour but to mercy. Musicians quote her in liner notes, painters title exhibitions after her essays. A generation of female creators, long denied access to influence, begins to see in her a blueprint for authority without aggression. In London's National Gallery, a portrait of her painted in middle age, serene, almost translucent, becomes an unlikely site of pilgrimage. Visitors stand before it in silence, some out of curiosity, some out of gratitude. A plaque below bears her own words: "Beauty is only useful when it teaches us how to love." Her moral philosophy, once considered sentimental, begins to shape the tone of national conversation. In Parliament, a speech on foreign aid quotes her plea that wealth is measured by the kindness one can afford. A generation later, social workers cite her in training manuals, journalists in editorials, even politicians in moments of rare sincerity. Without ever drafting a manifesto, she has furnished Britain with a moral lexicon. Words like decency, grace, and patience, which, though old-fashioned, regain their dignity through her memory. Scholars call it Dianism, the belief that strength and compassion are not opposites but extensions of the same courage. The term begins as an academic jest but grows into something genuine, a shorthand for moral equilibrium. Her influence extends quietly into the monarchy itself. The Queen, now seasoned by decades of reign, often reflects her mentor's tone: deliberate, compassionate, unfailingly courteous. When she addresses the nation during crisis, listeners recognize echoes of Diana's phrasing: the balance of sorrow and resolve, the cadence that invites reflection rather than reaction. In private journals, the Queen writes that Diana taught her the art of enduring with grace, of speaking to the heart rather than to history. Through that inheritance, the moral voice that once comforted Britain in wartime becomes embedded in its ceremonial heart. Internationally, her legacy spreads through the Commonwealth. Schools in India, Canada, and Kenya adopt her essays as reading material, interpreting her advocacy for empathy as the earliest form of post-imperial reconciliation. At the United Nations, a diplomat quotes her in a speech on cultural preservation: "Civilization is not a monument of stone, but of manners." The hall rises in applause. For a brief moment, her voice, once broadcast through a crackling wartime radio, seems to echo again across oceans. In literature, too, she lingers. biographers struggle to contain her within categories: feminist yet traditional, aristocratic yet populist, devout yet independent. Some call her the conscience of her century, others a bridge between its contradictions. But the truest tributes come not from scholars, but from ordinary people. In the 1990s, a nurse in Manchester writes to a newspaper describing how her grandmother, inspired by Diana's wartime speeches, joined the National Health Service instead of emigrating. She said Miss Cooper made her proud to be kind, the letter reads. That phrase, proud to be kind, becomes the title of a television documentary a few years later, reintroducing Diana's life to a new generation that knows only the modern world's hurried cadence. Viewers watch in awe as recordings of her voice, patient, warm, resolute, fill their living rooms. It feels like rediscovering an ancestor they never knew they had. Cultural historians begin to trace the subtle ways her ideals reshaped British character. They note how the rhetoric of leadership shifted in her wake. Less bluster, more composure, less spectacle, more sincerity. They find her fingerprints on post-war humanitarian policy, on the arts councils she inspired, on the moral education reforms that bore her influence long after her death. But they also note something intangible, a certain refinement of national tone, as if Britain, through her, learned to replace arrogance with courtesy and nostalgia with reflection. In the small Sussex village where she lived and died, her cottage is preserved as a museum. Modest, unpretentious, filled with books and the faint smell of lavender. Visitors wander through her study, where her writing desk still holds a fountain pen and a half-finished letter. The window opens onto the garden she tended, its flowers still blooming in the rhythms she once recorded. Roses for forgiveness, lavender for patience, ivy for endurance. At noon each day, the church bell still rings, echoing faintly through the valley. Those who stand in her garden swear that the sound lingers longer than elsewhere, as if the air itself remembers her listening. In schools, her birthday becomes an unofficial day of reflection. Children are asked to write letters to someone who changed the world with kindness. Many write to her, though they know she is long gone. Their letters fill archives in London, small voices thanking her for making goodness seem possible. It is in those letters, more than any monument or documentary, that her spirit truly lives. And so, though she never held office, never commanded armies, never sought titles, Diana Cooper becomes, in death, what she might never have dared to imagine in life, the moral face of modern Britain. Not its ruler, not its reformer, but its conscience. Enduring, luminous, tender. History, which so often remembers the loudest, finds room at last for the quietest. And now, as history's long tide draws back, we must turn from the world that might have been to the one that was. For in truth, Diana Cooper did not defy convention in the way our imagining has allowed. She lived gracefully, yes, and shone brilliantly within her own time. But she never took up the mantle of conscience, never sought to reform the nation's heart. In the world we inherited, she remained what society permitted her to be, a dazzling figure at the edge of history's great stage, her potential folded carefully within the silks of propriety. It is here, in this comparison between the lived and the possible, that the poignancy of her story deepens. What would Britain have been had she dared the path of solitude that so few women of her class were allowed to tread? In our real history, she followed the gentler current expected of her. She married Duff Cooper, the statesman who adored her beauty and wit, but whose ambitions drew her into the machinery of diplomacy rather than the freedom of thought. As Viscountess Norwich, she stood beside him through postings and politics, charming salons and embassies, her grace admired, but her depth largely unseen. Her life, while glittering, became a tapestry woven more of presence than of purpose. The war years still found her serving, her courage genuine. But her voice, that rare instrument of moral lucidity, remained untrained, its music confined to private sympathy rather than public transformation. She lived, as so many gifted souls have lived, within the boundaries of her century's decorum. Yet we must be gentle in our judgment, for who among us born into expectation can entirely escape it? She was raised in an era when even brilliance was to be worn discreetly by women, like a brooch rather than a banner. To have resisted that weight would have demanded a rebellion not only against her class, but against an entire civilization's notion of womanhood. And so she did what she could within the limits given her. She illuminated the rooms she entered, lent charm to the gatherings of men who shaped policy, and softened with laughter the rigid edges of power. It was a quieter influence, indirect, almost invisible. And yet, what if it had not been? If we imagine again the alternate Diana, the one who walked alone, who refused marriage, who chose the pen and microphone as her altar, we begin to see not only what might have changed, but what might have been preserved. Perhaps Britain would have learned humility earlier, compassion sooner. Perhaps art would have entered politics with more grace and leadership with more patience. Perhaps the 20th century, so often cruel in its certainties, would have paused more often to listen to the moral intelligence of its women. For what we truly lost when Diana's voice remained confined to salons was not fame or progress, but balance, that delicate counterweight of empathy against the machinery of ambition. It is tempting to believe that history could not have been otherwise, that it flows as inevitably as a river toward the sea. But rivers can change course. They are shaped by courage as much as by stone. Had Diana Cooper become the face of modern Britain, as our imagining has allowed, she might have softened the nation's self-regard. She might have offered an example of power expressed through grace, intellect without arrogance, beauty in service of truth. Her presence in the public sphere could have lent the century a different tone, less iron, more light, and though the wars might still have come, perhaps their aftermaths would have been kinder. To consider what was lost is not to condemn the world we have, but to understand its silences. For every voice like Diana's that remains unheard, there are countless others, women and men alike, whose gentler wisdoms never found their way into policy, whose compassion was mistaken for weakness, whose restraint was dismissed as irrelevance. History, written by the loud, forgets the quiet. It records the deeds of those who conquered, not those who consoled. Yet consolation, too, is a form of victory, one that leaves no monuments but lingers in memory like fragrance on air. And so, as we look upon the life that was, we might ask, what does a nation lose when it silences its own conscience in favor of convenience? The answer is not measured in power or territory, but in spirit. For what Britain gained in empire, it may have lost in tenderness. What it built in strength, it often neglected in soul. The imagined Diana Cooper, the moral architect of a gentler Britain, reminds us that history's progress is not only a matter of invention, but of intention. She reminds us that every era carries within it the possibility of grace, and that every life, if allowed to unfold freely, can become an instrument of moral harmony. There is an ache in knowing what could have been, but also a strange comfort. For perhaps imagining her differently keeps her alive in another form, not as the woman history recorded, but as the spirit it needed. In conjuring her defiance, we redeem her silence. In picturing her as Britain's conscience, we remind ourselves that the work of conscience is never finished, only inherited. And maybe, in some unseen way, she still walks beside the world that continues to change too quickly for its own heart. A figure of grace, urging us, as she once might have done, to rebuild, not with pride, but with kindness. And now, as we arrive at the quiet edge of this imagining, it is time to let the light fade and to stand in the stillness that follows a story well told. the life we have traced, both the one that was and the one that might have been, lies before us like two rivers meeting in the dusk, their waters mingling until distinction itself becomes meaningless. Somewhere between them stands the figure of Diana Cooper, neither saint nor specter, but a mirror through which we glimpse not only the past, but our own enduring hunger for meaning. For every "what if" whispered by history is, in truth, a question we ask of ourselves. What courage did we forfeit? What tenderness did we silence? What beauty did we mistake for vanity? And what conscience did we bury beneath the noise of progress? In this final imagining, time softens. The centuries seem to breathe together. Diana, whether of this world or the other, becomes less a person than a presence. The distilled essence of grace that moves quietly through every act of kindness, every word spoken with care, every silence held with understanding. Perhaps she never changed Britain with her voice, but Britain was changed all the same by those who kept her spirit alive, by all who refused to believe that compassion must yield to ambition. Her legacy, whether real or dreamed, is not carved in stone but sown in gestures, in the unrecorded mercies that sustain civilization when politics falter. If we listen closely, we may still hear her, not in speeches or recordings, but in the small acts of decency that continue despite everything. A hand extended to a stranger, a child reading softly to an aging parent, a teacher speaking to her students about empathy rather than achievement. These are the living echoes of the world she might have built. They are the quiet revolutions that no history book records yet, which hold the world together when all else fails. It is in such moments that the alternate Britain, her Britain, still breathes. A nation not defined by triumphs or empires, but by its capacity for forbearance, its tenderness, its moral rhythm. There is a kind of peace in knowing that history's unfinished symphonies remain open to the imagination. They remind us that the future, too, is always unwritten, and that the gentler possibilities of the past are never lost, only waiting for rediscovery. To picture Diana Cooper standing before the microphone, her calm voice threading through the static of a frightened world, is to be reminded that goodness need not roar to be remembered. It is enough that it speaks once, clearly into the dark, and that the echo finds another heart willing to listen. As the long story closes, the scene returns one last time to the quiet of her garden. The hour is late. The sky has turned the color of faded silk. The roses bend slightly under the weight of dew, and the wind carries the faint tolling of a distant bell. Its sound is neither mournful nor triumphant, only steady, eternal, a pulse of continuity between what was and what might yet be. The air is filled with that most delicate of silences, the kind that follows comprehension. Perhaps in that silence history itself pauses to remember her, or to remember what she represented. That there is a nobility in restraint, a courage in gentleness, and a power in refusing cruelty's disguise of strength. And as the final note of the bell dissolves into the night, we are left with the same question that began this long reverie. What if one life, lived differently, could have changed the moral temperature of an age? We cannot know, but in asking, we become aware of the question's quiet invitation, that each of us holds within the same capacity to tilt the world, however slightly, toward grace. Perhaps that is the truest answer Diana leaves us, that the work of conscience belongs to no single figure, no single era, but to the slow, patient labor of human decency itself. The wind still moves through the garden. The bell falls silent. The night deepens, and the story becomes memory, not ended, but entrusted. And somewhere, between the fading echoes of time and the soft breath of the present, the whisper lingers. Be kind. Be brave. Keep the candle lit.